a house of prayer, you've made it a robber's den. And that makes the chief priests and the scribes upset. They consider it their territory, certainly their house. Things have gone the way they've wanted it to go, or it would be otherwise. And they're indignant by this, and even cry out, "Do you hear what's being said?" And Jesus says, "That's right. Yes, I do hear, and it's a good thing that even out of infants and nursing babes, praise has been prepared for God." And so there's this interesting mix of celebration, the former blind folks and the lame folks that have been coming in and Jesus is healing them, and all this incredible, positive, amazing, awesome experience for all those that are in the temple. The temple hasn't seen worship within its walls like this in who knows how long, where people are genuinely just so excited about who God is and what God is doing in their life and who Jesus is as the Messiah. And then you have that tension of the indignant spiritual leaders or supposed religious leaders. And then in verse 17, he leaves them and goes out of the city to Bethany. And he said, "No longer shall there be any fruit from you." And at once the fig tree withered, the leaves withered. Seeing this, the disciples were amazed and asked, "How did the fig tree wither all at once?" And Jesus answered and said to them, "Truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what was done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, 'Be taken up and cast into the sea,' it will happen. And all things that you ask in prayer, believing, you will receive." And then he entered the temple, and in the conversation with the chief priests and scribes continue. What an interesting paragraph. What a fascinating paragraph. Some incredible things here are happening, but one of the larger questions is, what does this have to do with, why does Jesus pick on a poor fig tree? So let's look at some of the things involved in this paragraph. It's absolutely fascinating. First of all, the first thing that I'm kind of noticing is in verse 20, the disciples were amazed. How did the fig tree wither at once? Really? We're 3 years-ish down the road in Jesus' ministry. Let's just take a little inventory. What have the disciples seen? Well, let me think now. Let's see. They've watched Jesus heal the sick. They have watched Jesus calm a storm. I mean, his power over nature itself, and the storm immediately stops, and the boat immediately is transported to the other side. They've watched Jesus walk on water in the middle of another storm. They even saw him provide for Peter to walk on water for a brief period. They've watched Jesus cast out demons, men who were so cruelly demon-possessed they had been bound with chains and cables, and those things couldn't hold him. They have watched Jesus raise people from the dead. There's the little girl. There's the young man of Nain. They were there when he raised Lazarus from the dead, having been in the tomb 4 days. And they're amazed that he can curse a fig tree. I'm amazed that they're amazed. Are you amazed? Just in the previous paragraph, just that day before, he healed the blind and the lame. That's why they're in the temple and all the celebration was happening. So I'm amazed that they're amazed that he can curse a fig tree. So that's one thing. Secondly, why is he so hard on fig trees? In fact, let's turn to Mark chapter 11. Mark is the other gospel writer that includes this same event that happens. And Mark gives us a little detail, which I don't know if it helps or hurts. We'll see. So this is Mark chapter 11, verse 12. On the next day, when they had left Bethany, he became hungry. Seeing at a distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to it to see if perhaps he would find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And then Mark adds, the next day, as they're passing by in verse 20 in the morning, they see the fig tree withered from the roots up. I mean, completely dead. Not just how the leaves withered at once, but from the root up, the entire tree is stone dead by the next morning. Being reminded, Peter said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered. So, Jesus doesn't just stunt it. He doesn't just burn it a little bit. It's dead. Why did he curse the poor fig tree? Especially, let's go back to verse 13. It was not the season for figs. Well, that's not fair. It'd be like being mad at an apple tree for not having apples in January. What is going on? This is a passage that I have puzzled over and wondered about, and surprisingly, at least in my research, I haven't found commentaries that talk much about it other than, oh, look, Jesus has the power to kill trees and move on. But this seems so unfair, so unkind. But there's a little hint here and then a little background. Verse 13, Mark says, seeing at a distance a fig tree in leaf. So the fact that the fig tree has leaves makes it stand out. Okay, let's go back to Matthew now. Matthew, verse 19, Matthew tells us a very similar thing. Seeing a lone fig tree by the road, he came to it and found nothing on it except leaves only. Mark adds that's why he went to it, is that he could see or notice that he could see the leaves from a distance. So I've puzzled over this passage for a long time and hadn't found a whole lot of help. And then we lived on the West Coast for a while, and we were excited about the environment. It's one of those places where it's a temperate climate and there's water readily available, and if you irrigate something, you can grow. In fact, you can grow it. I remember one of our church members brought us fruit regularly. Had the best tasting peaches and nectarines and plums and just amazing. And then finally one day they invited us over to have lunch and take a tour of his farm, and I was so excited about just imagining the rolling hills of the peach orchards and the nectarine orchards and the plum. I don't know if that's an orchard or a thicket or a tree or a what, but couldn't wait to see this amazing production. And so we got their address and we drove into a trailer park. A trailer park. Now, it was a nice trailer park. It was for one of those retirement parks. And we drive in there, and they lived in a double wide in a lot on a simple small lot with all these other trailers. No grass, nothing but rocks surrounding it. And all of these little trees were growing out of 5-gallon buckets. And when I was getting the tour, I said, how? And he said, well, he would eat a peach at the grocery store and be like, ooh, this is a really good one. So he'd save the pit and he would plant it in a little container, and then it would sprout, and then he would transform it to a bucket, and then he set up a little drip system so it dripped in the bucket on a regular basis. And he was producing all of this fruit out of 5-gallon buckets. So there's a peach tree in a bucket. There's a nectarine tree in the bucket. And he'd have 2 or 3. There's a little plum tree thing in a bucket. All of this out of buckets. So you're talking about this amazing. Now, I don't care how great the environment is. I never pulled that off. But we were in this fun environment where you could grow things. And so we got all excited and we started ordering stuff online. And we ordered what was called these bare root trees. And so we got a lemon tree and an orange tree and a tree that had 4 different kinds of varieties of apples grafted on, and a pear tree with 3 different kinds of pears. And we got cherry trees. Just it's almost like we ordered like 1 or 2 of everything, nectarines and all that. Well, when it come in the mail, I don't know what I was expecting, but we ordered bare root. We literally got a stick in the mail. It came in a cardboard tube. You pulled it out, and you get a stick. And I thought, oh, we've been had. That's what we get for ordering online. But we follow the instructions, and you stick the stick in a bucket of dirt, and you water it. And guess what happens in the spring? The thing buds out, And then you give it 2 years, 3, and you all of a sudden, as you transfer it into the ground for its final spot, you start getting fruit. It was an amazing thing. Well, one of the things that we planted was actually 2 different fig trees. Now, I had never been around fig trees in my life. Well, I hadn't been around most of this thing. So we had this tree and that tree and this tree. We're all excited about that. We planted our 2 fig trees, and I learned so much about fig trees. When they bore fruit, didn't take them long. The thing that was the most surprising and the most disappointing, my wife loves figs, and so when it was time to go, she'd go, sample them, and they'd finally be ready. And oh boy, picked a fresh fig, and I was so excited. She gave me one. I took a bite, and did you know that a natural fig picked right off the tree tastes absolutely nothing like a fig Newton? I was crushed. I should have tried planting a fig Newton in a 5-gallon bucket and see if I could get that, because that's what I was hoping for. And turns out figs don't taste much like a fig Newton. It was a shame. But the 2 things that I learned about the Bible from planting fig trees was, number 1, I understood the idea, the expression we use of having a fig leaf, that you hide behind a fig leaf, or the idea of Adam and Eve being covered in fig leaves, because our fig leaves were next to an apricot tree, and the apricot tree produces a little leaf about that long and about that wide, little bitty leaves. Fig tree leaves are huge. I mean, you could use one for a hat. They're massive leaves. But the other thing that was stunning, that I finally understood what happened right here in Matthew 21, the fig tree is really unique among most fruit trees. So our peach trees, for example, follow the typical kind of spring. So in the spring, after them being dormant and just being, bare sticks all winter, when the spring comes, you see the little leaves start to come out, and then there'd be a little bud. And after the leaves kind of begin to develop, then you'd see this little blossom come out. Beautiful. Peach trees are beautiful. I think they could be mistaken for flower trees. They're so pretty. They get covered in these little blossoms, and some of the trees are white, some are pink, and they're just covered in these petals. It's absolutely beautiful. And then after they've been pollinized, then where the blossom is, the little fruit bud begins to grow, and the little petals are released. And when you have peach orchards, as we often did down the road from us, they'd start to let go in the light wind, and it would be like snow. You'd be like driving through white and sometimes pink and white blizzards of peach blossoms, and it just smelled fantastic, and so on. So most of the fruit trees in the spring, the leaves come out, and then there's the little bud that turns into a blossom, and then it turns into the little fruit, and it grows, and then there's your little baby peach or apple or nectarine or whatever. And so that's the normal order of things in the spring, is you get the leaf, and then you get the blossom, and then you get the fruit. Fig trees are quite different, not just the size of their leaves, but the order is different. They too are bare all winter. But when spring comes, the first thing on a fig tree to come out is the fruit. So it's sort of peculiar that you look across your backyard and you got all these little trees growing, and here's your peach tree all covered in beautiful blossoms, and your apple trees and your nectarines, and here's still a bare, naked fig tree, not a leaf on it, but the little buds or the little fruit, the little fig, no blossoms, just the little fruit bud. And then it gets a little bigger and gets a little bigger and gets a little bigger. And then finally, the leaves start to come out. So what's fascinating is that most fruit trees, the leaf comes first, then the blossom, then the fruit. With the fig tree, it's the fruit first, then the leaves. And so after being around the fig tree and then studying along one day, reading this passage, all of a sudden, what's significant is the way it's worded in verse 19. Seeing a lone fig tree by the road, he came to it and found nothing on it except leaves only. If a fig tree produces the fruit first, then the leaves. That means if a fig tree has leaves, it must also have what? Fruit. Now, Mark said that Jesus saw it leafed out from a distance, although it wasn't the season for figs. It's a little too early yet. We're talking about the spring. We're talking about coming up on the Passover. We're talking about how the crucifixion is going to be at Passover. So we're talking about early spring. So for it to already have leaves, that means by fig tree standards, it must first have produced the fruit. If it has leaves, and it is a early bloomer, if you will, or an early leaver, I guess. So Mark says, even though it wasn't the season for figs, the reason that Jesus from a distance saw it, he was attracted to it. He made the journey. He traveled all the way to it. He crossed the distance because the fig tree is in leaf. So the fig tree is advertising, I have fruit. That's what fig trees do. Fruit first, then leaves. For it to have leaves, it's saying, look at me, I've matured. The leaves are out. That means I have fruit. And then Jesus gets over to it, and it has leaves. It's all leaves and no fruit. You've heard all hat, no cattle. It's all leaves and no fruit, which means it's a lying fig tree. It's a dishonest fig tree that it claims it has an appearance. Come to me, I'm worth the journey. If you're hungry, come and I'll feed you. I'll provide for you. I'll nourish you. And you get there and all you find is empty shade. You didn't travel there for shade. You traveled because you were hungry. Why is this paragraph right in the middle? Why does this paragraph split the narrative of the cleansing of the temple? Don't people travel great distances to go to the temple? What is the purpose of going to the temple? Is it not for spiritual nourishment? Is it not to worship God, to be in the presence of God, to receive the blessing of God, to offer your sacrifices, to hear from the Word of God? Is it not to come into His presence and thus be fed and nourished by God's being? What are the chief priests and the scribes saying? Come and we will nourish you. Come to the temple because this is about God. And when you travel all the way to get to the temple, what do you find? Do you find fruit? Are you nourished by the presence of God and the holiness of God? Or do you find corruption and dishonest money changers and priests that are serving themselves? And how do you leave the temple? Empty. Hungrier than ever. The fig tree is a powerful visual of the tragedy of empty spiritual leadership. This claim, look at me, this appearance, you can see me from far away, look at me, see how I stand out, I'm different, come all this way. And the tragedy of people making the trip only to starve to death. And Jesus says, may no one ever eat fruit of you again. And instantly the leaves wither, and more importantly, that tree dies from the root up. Where does that put the chief priests? Where does that put the scribes when they offer nothing but shade? I think it's fascinating that we have a modern cultural expression to make fun of somebody or to put down somebody or to criticize somebody. If you're hip and cool, you call it throwing shade. And I guess it's maybe comes to the idea of your instead of them being in the limelight and the glory and the lights and the attention, is you cover that, you throw shade at them, you snuff out the light, or you cover, they're not in the limelight anymore, they're throwing shade. And that's exactly what a fruitless tree does, is just throw shade. There's no fruit, there's no nourishment. The disciples are amazed simply at Jesus cursing the tree. Jesus doesn't curse the tree because he's cranky. We suggested at the end of the previous lesson, was he hangry? Was he angry because he was hungry? No, there was a powerful visual way to teach the disciples and you and I the error and the tragedy of a fruitless religion, of a fruitless relationship with God. Now, when they're amazed at Jesus' power, he then takes the opportunity to teach them the deeper lesson in verse 21. Truly, I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what was done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, be taken up and cast into the sea, it will happen. Oh, this passage has been used to make all kinds of claims. If you just believe enough, then fill in the blank's going to happen. But in the context, what or who is the fig tree? The emptiness of the false teachers, of those who claim to be able to bring you blessings from God, and yet they have no connection of their own, and they're just throwing shade. So if a fig tree is a false claim to nourishment and provision, what is a mountain? A mountain is nearly always used, as it is in this example, as an obstacle. Kind of we take for granted. But one of the things, if you read exploration history, the folks that get in a wagon and start traveling to a new land for new opportunities, and how we make those trips, and we complain if it's an airplane, we complain that it's a matter of hours. If we're driving, it's maybe a day or so, and we cross great expanses. But people took months and years to make the same journey, and what it would have been like to be trudging along on a horse or sitting on a squeaking seat of a wagon pulled by a team of tired horses or mules, and to come to, can you imagine the first settler to be going along in the heat of Arizona, and then they get to the edge of the Grand Canyon and just look at that and go, oh. That's why some towns are founded where they're founded, because I'm out, I'm done, right here, I love it, this looks good to me. Or to come across the plains and to see the Rocky Mountains, or to go across the deserts of Nevada and find another mountain range. To see a mountain is to see such an obstacle, because could you imagine trying to cross the Rockies in a wagon? There are no roads. The trees and the boulders and the steepness and the incline and the rivers and the canyons and the gorges, and just, mountains are obstacles. So Jesus talks about the emptiness of false religion and the obstacles that presents. Both of those, he says, are not a problem for those who have faith, that is, that have a trust relationship with the Father. Verse 22, in all things that you ask in prayer, believing, you will receive. Flip over to the book of James real quick. Like I said, this paragraph has been used to justify all kinds of strange prayer requests, from winning the lottery to justifying behaviors or certain possessions. But James comments upon such an attitude or approach in chapter 4, verse 1, when he says, what is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is not the source your pleasures that wage war in your members? You lust and do not have, so you commit murder. You are envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. However, verse 3, you ask and do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, so that you may spend it on your pleasures. You adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility toward God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. And so on. So James comments on, if you're asking for the wrong motives, personal pleasure, self-interest, we've been in 3 chapters worth in Matthew now about self-centeredness is resilient and dies hard and must be put to death regularly. So if you're going to make prayer that, you're right back in the same place where the chief priests and the scribes are. You may sound good or it may seem appropriate, but you're right back to the fig tree that's all leaves and no fruit. But it's interesting that we will find that we will find nourishment and that we will see any obstacle removed when we're truly following Jesus. So Jesus was upset, and he had no patience for lying fig trees or empty religion.